Hello, this is Graham, and these are my notes for week 3 of the CIPD Developing Skills for Business Leadership module. This week's session, based on Chapter 3, is on practical aspects of postgraduate study skills, which in practice, as far as the CIPD is concerned in this chapter, is really all about critical writing. So let's have a look and see what kind of things they've been saying and see if I can give you a little bit of a context for them. The CIPD's chapter really focuses around report writing and academic writing, which is fine, but actually as HR professionals we get involved in all sorts of different types of writing. I tend to recognise 7 different forms. Very quickly, they are sales writing, informal messaging, speech writing, formal communication rather than standing up and just speaking ad hoc, something that has been somehow planned, or could and more often will be a written document. Opinion sharing, which could be opinion editorial, op-ed, which is the bulk of the material that you'll find in most magazines and journals. Blogging, which of course is a very big form of opinion editorial, or reviewing, which again is sharing your opinions about something or a service. Then there's report writing and academic writing. So those two are the two that the CIPD tends to focus on. I'll have a word about those, but I want to have a look at some of the others as well. The question, I suppose, comes back to how much of these are critical. Well, they're critical in the sense that if you get them wrong, you can cause untold damage. Not only can you destroy the reputation of yourself and your career, but you can also have a massively bad impact on the reputation of your organisation. So I will have a look at some of those. The big difference between most of them is around the structure of the document or the structure of the writing or prose and the style in which it's written. If any of you haven't already explored it on Word and quite a few other packages, there is in the review section an option to have the machine calculate using a couple of algorithms the typical reading age or US grade of the people who are going to be reading it. It's well worth having a little explore with that. My writing, for example, is typically graded at undergraduate and postgraduate level, which means that if I'm writing something for a more popular audience, I've got to deliberately make sure that I bring it down in terms of sentence length, length of words and so on, and complexity of sentences, so that it's more easily accessible to that group of people. It's well worth exploring because as HR professionals we could very easily be communicating to quite specific groups, and our writing needs to match their reading styles. Okay, let's have a look then at some of these structures. Before I do so, there are 3 overarching requirements to my mind in any of the writing that we do. They are grammar, spelling, and attention to detail. I admit that I am probably at the extreme end of my concern about grammar and spelling and attention to detail. But I am very aware that I hear so many times of people who have not been interviewed for a job. And when I ring up and I try and speak to somebody to get a third party to get feedback on them, the feedback that I almost always get from interviewers and HR professionals is that their application didn't go beyond the very first stage, and that was because their covering letter or their CV either had bad grammar, bad spelling, or the detail wasn't there. So really, really important, both at our own level and as professionals putting out something which is going to affect the reputation of our department, of ourselves and of our organisation. Very important that we get those 3 right. Just to give a simple illustration of this, here is one of the slides from one of the PowerPoint presentations that the CIPD have provided us with to use with you. You've seen this particular slide. What's wrong with it? That very first paragraph Critical thinking, reading and writing are the pillars of postgraduate study, managerial work and continuing professional development. Hang on. Critical thinking, reading and writing. Can you see the problem with that? What they actually meant to say, and this is an example where simply putting the words in wouldn't help, but you've got to really restructure that sentence to make it absolutely clear. The pillars of postgraduate study, managerial work, and continuing professional development are the ability to think, read, and write in a critical fashion. Can you see the difference? It's that kind of lack of attention to detail and poor grammar that we really need to be on top of. I'll take another example there. It's got a slide about a critical literature review. Now, okay, it's a slide. It's just a PowerPoint slide. But this is saying something about the attention to detail that the CIPD have paid to their slide deck. A critical literature review has the following characteristics. Now look at the letters that begin those sentences, or those bullet points. Lowercase, breadth, depth, rigour. Capital, clarity, conciseness. Lowercase, effective, analysis. Yes, it's pedantic, but it looks sloppy. And that's the kind of thing that we've really got to get on top of. It's simple. You just don't make the mistake in the first place. Okay, let's move on then. Let's have a look at some structure of specific types of communication. There's a really simple formula which was first put out back in the 1920s by an organisation called Dale Carnegie and Associates, which is still going strong these days. In a book which was written at the time and has been re-edited and re-edited loads and loads of times since, written by a chap by the name of Whiting, called The 5 Great Rules of Selling. In the 5 Great Rules of Selling, he spells out a formula, a structure to all sales letters. The 5 steps are attention, interest, conviction, desire, and close. I actually use that for an enormous number of documents. Whenever I'm writing something almost, it has that same structure. He has a good logical argument for why each of those things are in place and why they appear in that particular sequence. I'm not sure what the evidence is behind that to back it up, but there's no other model around to help us come up with a structure to selling letters. Now bear in mind that of those different types of communication that I was talking about earlier, several of them are to do with selling. In fact, I think the first 3 of them are to do with selling. So understanding the structure of a sales message is really important. A lot of the time as HR professionals, what we are doing is trying to sell an idea or a way of doing something or get engagement with a process. That is about selling. And so understanding that structure is very important. To try and help, I've written 3 different articles, and they are all about this structure and explain the context of selling. And I've put a link to those on the VLE so that you can have a look at them if you want to. Let's have a look at speeches. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Alistair Cook and his letters from America. Alistair Cook was a journalist who lived in the States for much of his life. He died at the age of 95, having recorded his last broadcast a matter of 4 weeks before, in 2004. At that stage, he had recorded 2,869 episodes of his letter from America. And on top of that, there were more than 300 which had been written before he went over to the States from the UK. So they were letters from Britain. What's significant about Alistair Cook's writing? Well, they were speeches. He recorded 15-minute broadcasts every week without fail. Most of them were opinion-based, but essentially they were a form of entertainment. Speeches fall into 2 types. They're either selling something, in which case we stick to that attention, interest, conviction, desire and close formula, or else they're entertainment. And as I say, that's what Alistair Cook's letters from America were. Almost all of his letters had the same kind of structure. They consisted of at least 2, usually 3, sometimes as many as 5 anecdotes. These were simple little stories, often very personal first of all, then something with a bit more detail. After he'd done his anecdotes, he would then explain the connection between them, and then occasionally he would challenge the listener, a call to action if you like. That formula, anecdote A, anecdote B, possibly anecdotes C, D and E, an explanation of the connection and sometimes a challenge, has a striking similarity to the TED Talks. If you have a look at one of the common TED Talks, one of the popular ones, you'll usually find that the speaker has done just that. Anecdote A, anecdote B, anecdote C, an explanation of the connection, and then usually a call to action or something of that kind. Interestingly, both the TED Talks, which are limited to 16 minutes, and Alistair Cook's Letters from America, which were 15 minutes, have become a very popular duration, a very popular length of time for a talk to go on for. Sometimes a wee bit longer, but essentially that length. So give some thought. If you're called to write a speech or you're going to prepare a speech for something, think about that structure. Now, report writing. There is a absolutely universal structure to academic reports. Whether they're being used for publication, whether it's a thesis, whatever it is, if it's an academic document, it's almost universal that it will have this structure to it. There will be an abstract, an introduction, a review of the literature, a declaration or a summary of the methods that have been used, sometimes in more detail, sometimes in less detail, the results, no interpretation of them, just the facts, including all of the statistics. Then there will be the conclusions, followed by references and appendices. The less academic form, a corporate report, will have an executive summary, an introduction, a review of the literature, methods, findings, which will usually be just the immediate deductions, conclusions, some references if necessary, and then any appendices. What I've done on this slide is to try and highlight the areas that in a corporate project would be reduced. So the literature review, the findings and the references, or even some that you might find are actually omitted. And it's quite interesting how often in a corporate report any actual data is removed. The results aren't provided. They may be included in an appendix, but generally a corporate report will skip the results section. It'll put in some findings. Let me just make it clear what the difference is between findings and conclusions. Findings are the immediate deductions that you make from the data. Conclusions are your interpretations, are further hypotheses that data has made you think of, or any recommendations that you've got for example, a management team to do something. That's the difference, if you like, between findings and conclusions. For an academic report, for an academic thesis or whatever, the references really should include everything that has been cited in the text. As we have pointed out to us in the library tour, what's important is that as a writer of a thesis or a journal article, you should never be accused of plagiarism. You should never have your writing left ambiguous so that somebody can turn around and say you have claimed that this is your work when in fact you've got it from somebody else. A friend of mine who is a psychiatrist was actually struck off as a psychiatrist for 3 months because he had written a popular book in which he had explained something very clearly to people, but he hadn't made his source clear in the book. And he was called before the British Medical Council, the General Medical Council, and he was struck off as a psychiatrist for 3 months as a punishment for failing to recognise all of the people that had contributed to that work. So it's really important that you make sure that you cover yourself by citing where you've got the information from. Obviously, it's less likely to be a problem when you're writing a corporate report, but even then, you won't be liked by your peers if you're claiming you've done something and actually it was their work. So in summary, fundamentally, all writing is about its question of purpose. Writing is either there to sell, in other words, to try and capture the attention, to win the minds and hearts, to demonstrate empathy, to empower the reader in the short term. Or it's there to report, in which case it needs to provide the resources for informed decision making. Usually, reports work to a shorter time scale. They're concerned with short or medium term decision making. And it's usually by an audience who've got some kind of connection to the subject. Sometimes reports also have to sell, and one of the mistakes that a lot of report writers make is that they provide the report and expect everybody to believe it and to buy into it. And as consultants, it was always a bit of a joke that you would go in, you would do some work, you would write a 100-page report, present it to the company, it would just be used as a doorstop for a manager's office. It's really important that you cover both aspects, usually in 2 separate documents. And then the third purpose is one of intellectualizing. In other words, providing original research or insights that can be used in the future, usually longer term, and they're possibly going to be used by a completely unrelated audience. And they'll do so to support their decision making. So that's the purpose, and that leads us into then the style with which we write. This is not tablets of stone, but as a general rule, documents that are selling are written in the first person, they use immediate language, they tend to be informal, and they tend to draw on emotions. Documents that are a form of report tend to be written in either the first or second person, I, you, we. They tend to be logical, they have a logical structure to them. They are generally evidence-backed. They can be, quite often are, biased because they are presenting one interpretation of the logic, and they have to be important. It's important that they're open to challenge. People can recognize that there is something going on here which is leading them down a particular trail, and they need to have that ability to challenge the report. Intellectualizing documents, theses, journal articles, so on, are generally written in the third person. The logic tends to be more rigorous, will explore alternative avenues. It relies on detailed evidence and usually new data, which needs to be statistically validated. Or else if it's just a literature review, then it depends upon purely cited sources. Generally, they're not biased towards a particular outcome, though some academics are better at that than others. And usually they do expect them to be criticised. Not just challenged, but quite rigorously criticised. Okay, that's my context for writing, and critical writing in particular, and I'm afraid I've gone on to nearly 20 minutes again. Sorry about that. Take care, guys.